Well, Governor Jay Inslee, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate anything that's a pod, including our pod of orcas, which I'm concerned about right now because of climate change.
Yes, definitely. Well, you grew up in Seattle. You spent most of your life in Washington. How have you seen the impacts of a warming planet on Washington just play out in your own life?
Well, unfortunately, it's everywhere in my life. I mean, I can't turn around and not seeing it. Yesterday, I was in Spelem, this little town on the Colville Indian Reservation, east of Washington. It got hit by the third of their, 1,000-year fires in 5 years. It's wiped out half their timber assets. It almost burned down the whole town. We just rescued it by some airdrops, literally at the last moment. So yesterday I saw it. The day before that, I was walking on the beach, and I live on an island in Puget Sound, where billions of clams and mussels cook in their shell and are now rotting on our beaches up and down the Pacific Northwest. The day before that, I was hiking on the shoulders of Mount Rainier in Spray Park, which is a place I've gone to for the first time I went there was 50 years ago. And I went back. And the good news is the flowers were beautiful, but the bad news is the glaciers are disappearing quite rapidly. Glacier National Park won't have glaciers in 50 years. It'll be the park formerly known as Glacier. And the alpine meadows that I love, and my folks worked for summers restoring the alpine meadows, are going to be gone because the tree line is moving up because of temperature changes, and that will crowd out the alpine meadows. So we'll have Douglas fir trees, but we won't have avalanche lilies. And so, I mean, literally, I can't turn around where I don't see the face of climate change and see the victims of climate change. It's even breathing. Yesterday, when I was in the Okanagan, choking on this smoke that's now all the way to the East Coast, for goodness sakes. So you can't escape it. And what I would say is climate change, you can run, but you can't hide. I think that was Joe Lewis's line, the old boxer. He said they can run, but they can't hide. And that's the situation we're in right now.
Sure. And you talked about the victims, and the Washington Department of Health just announced that 112 people died from the extreme heat wave that hit the state at the end of June, and making that heat wave the deadliest weather-related event in Washington's history. So as governor, what do states like Washington need to do to prevent or mitigate tragedies like this in the future?
Well, there are many things we need to do. We need to improve our assets that we have for suppressing fires, which we're doing by the tens of millions of dollars. We're pouring in more money to that. We need to have increased investment in managing some of our forests to make them less susceptible to these fires. We need to make sure we have as many cooling centers and information to people so they don't die of heat stroke. On those kind of short-term things. But look, these are Band-Aids. And it's kind of, I liken this to, World War II. We didn't World War II by building more air raid shelters. You have to go on the offense. We have to defeat climate change. You can't solve this problem with just mitigation. What are we going to eat, right? So our wheat resources were probably significantly suppressed. We're losing a good part of our raspberry crop and our oyster crop. We have to eat, and you can't just solve this with air conditioners. So I guess what I would say is there's so many million things we have to do to try to ameliorate the impacts of this, but fundamentally we got to go in the offense if we're going to really protect our people, and that means doing the things that my state has done on cap bills to cap carbon and low carbon fuel standards and efficiency standards and electric cars and everything else.
And there is absolutely no doubt that we must decarbonize and do so quickly. But, as we've seen, as you've talked about, the evidence is clear. We need to do more to address the warming and the climate related events that we've already experienced, that we're experiencing right now. So as governor, how do you balance spending on decarbonization and adaptation?
Well, I don't do it through some numerical percentage. That kind of decision making we don't think that's the right way to do it. What I would say is we make decisions realizing that failure is not an option. So the first thing I would say is the only way to prevent massive loss of disruption of our economy and human life is to defeat climate change at its source. So when you think of your investment decision, you have to realize that. We could not have beat the fascists in World War II by just building defensive measures in New Jersey. You have to go to where the battle is. And the battle is to decarbonize our economy. I think we should start the discussion in that regard on how we think of the long-term measures that are necessary. Now, at the same time, you try to do the things that are cost-effective to reduce the current suffering that we have. But I just have to reiterate that short-term band-aids are not going to win this for us. And we can't be lulled into some sense of false security that we can solve this just by, putting our houses on stilts and eating sea rations. So that's how I look at these investment decisions.
You made a great point earlier that you run, but you can't hide from the climate crisis. We're seeing so many examples, all over the United States and all across the globe. But the particular events that have been happening in the West and in the Northwest have, I think, really caught a lot of people's attention. When you're hearing from other governors, especially in the West, about what they have seen just in 2021 alone, what are you hearing about the extreme weather events you're seeing across the country?
Well, my state is not unique. That's really bad news. British Columbia now has one of the largest fires, maybe in North American history. Same thing with Oregon. They have the largest fire in their history. My plight is the same for other Western governors. Now, I feel it differently than Colorado or Montana because we have the marine losses as well as the terrestrial losses. So we have salmon that can't go upriver to spawn because the water's too hot. Yesterday, they told me in the Colorado Reservation, they're going to have to start trucking salmon up to the smaller tributaries because the water's too hot. The salmon just won't go up. The oysters, which are, because of ocean acidification, that can't form the calcium bodies of the little oysters. We can't raise small oysters in Puget Sound without treating the water now sometimes. So we have the marine component of this different than the Rocky Mountains. But everyone has their share of this. In Iowa, it's the floods. I went to Hamburg, Iowa when I was running for president. Town was 140 years old. Now a flood just went through it 8 feet deep. It's the intrusion of water into the limestone and the Florida coastline. And we know all the concerns about that. It's the hurricanes in New Jersey. I mean, everybody has some taste of this in some way. It's the cold weather with the interruptions of the jet stream that the upper Midwest has been hit with, right? So it ain't global warming in those situations, it's freezing. And so what I would say is this is something, Bill Nye, the science guy, was with him at Mount St. Helens, our favorite volcano, the other day. And he said something I think is really true. He says, look, we are all in this together. I think that's an important message because all of us are potential victims of this in some way. And that means we all ought to work together. And I think that's the right way to look at it.
And that obviously goes for how we've approached COVID in this pandemic as well. You've rightfully so gotten a lot of accolades for your leadership during this time and how the state of Washington has reacted to the pandemic. I'm curious, during this pandemic, what have you learned that you think could be applied to the climate crisis?
I'm not sure this is totally politically correct, but I'll say it anyway. I've learned that Donald Trump is probably one of the most destructive Americans in the history of our great nation. What he did on denying climate change for 4 years and stop in our tracks the progress we were making in the federal government is an absolute abhorrent action by anyone. And he did the same thing on COVID by downplaying the importance of saving lives, by casting doubt on the science. That's one of the things I learned is to make sure he doesn't come back in any form, or any of his friends for that matter. So that's one of the things I learned. I also learned that if you listen to science, sometimes it's controversial, sometimes it's hard, but it usually works out pretty well. And that's what we've done in Washington. So we have followed the science. Some people haven't liked it, including Trump and some of his followers. But it has saved lives by the tens of thousands. If we'd had the same fatality rate as another state, I won't mention it, we would have had another 17,000 deaths in my state. That's a lot of people whose lives we saved by following science. So follow science, it'll treat you well long-term, and that's what we should be thinking. And, I've learned sometimes you gotta make tough decisions. Sometimes you gotta be out ahead a little bit, but that's why they pay us. We should be out ahead a little bit in public life.
Well, following science was a big part of your platform when you did run for president. You were the climate candidate during the 2020 Democratic presidential primary, and you made your climate playbook publicly available for anyone that wanted it when you dropped out. So from your list of policies, what do you most want to see President Biden adopt for the country that's going to help us transition to a more just and sustainable future?
Well, I think his adoption of the clean energy standard through the reconciliation bill is absolutely pivotal. I think the scale of his investments are absolutely pivotal. If I were to pick two things, I'd probably say that. I'd like to have a national cap and invest system like we have in Washington, but still the progress that he has proposed is very inspiring. I'm very happy of the direction he's leading us. So good on him and the legislators, Nancy Pelosi and Schumer and the whole crowd, Eddie Markey that are fighting in there, and no climate, no deal. That's probably the right way to look at this right now. And so I'm pleased by the ambitions that we're seeing of the Democratic leaders. It'd be great to have some Republican assistance. It's marginal to the extent it exists. Well, we're happy to carry the ball.
Well, under your leadership, Washington has passed several bills just this year to combat the climate crisis. Earlier this year, you signed the Climate Commitment Act, environmental justice legislation, as well as clean fuel standards. So how do other states use these bills as a blueprint for their own climate responses?
Well, I think the bills from a structural standpoint are really well defined, and they embrace a couple of principles that I think are important. One is equity. We really embraced environmental justice throughout our bills. We made them foundational. It wasn't just about the butterflies here. So we wanted to have equity. And that's why we made commitments of 35-40% to communities of color and poverty of our investments, why we did 10% for tribal communities. It's why we have the first, I'm very proud of this, measure that will judge the air quality of all airsheds to make sure they don't go down, to make sure they go up, of every individual airshed. That was one of the problems they faced in California, that there were concerns about concentration of pollution in BIPOC communities. Well, we gave a tool to make sure that doesn't happen. I think that's a useful thing to copy around. I think our prevailing wage things that give an incentive to those who benefit from these investments, make sure they're paying good family wage jobs. Obviously, unions can be important and part of that. So I think those are things I would suggest to other states. But there's another thing too, which is that, look, the argument against doing something about climate change is that it'll hurt your economy. Well, who's got one of the best economies in the United States? The state of Washington. Who was listed as the best place to live 2 years running, the last 2 years in a row? It's the state of Washington. So I think one of the benefits of what we've done is to demonstrate to people that this will build your economy and your culture and your health all at the same time.
And you called that back in 2007 when you co-wrote Apollo's Fire, Igniting America's Clean Energy Economy. You wrote that before you became governor. So obviously you knew a lot about the climate crisis then and our needed response to it. But I'm curious, since then, has your thinking, or how has your thinking evolved on being a real climate leader, and how do we act to combat the climate crisis?
I would like to say that I'm at a higher intellectual plane than I was in 2007. I can't have that ambition level. I think the way I've evolved is that through experience, and I heard somebody define experience the other day. Experience is what you get when you don't get what you wanted. So I've had a lot of experience when it comes to climate change. And I think the most important evolution I've had is to realize the importance of perseverance. Look, there ain't no genius here except the genius of perseverance. We just got to get up every single morning advocating for these positions, raising people's ambition levels, showing people what works. That's what we got to do. And I'm, when I get a little frustrated, I just think of, John Lewis, who fought civil rights for decades, and I'm no John Lewis. I don't want to say that. You think of that every social change has involved decades of people who were frustrated for decades, but they just had to stick to it. And I would say that's the one thing that I've evolved to understand. Technologically, I think the book that you mentioned is held up very well. The things that I believe were going to happen are happening. Solar power has come down even faster on price than I anticipated. Battery technology has continued to evolve even faster than I had predicted. So I think the vision that I laid out it has come to pass largely because of the geniuses we have creating these new technologies. And that is continuing. We are not at the end of this technological revolution. Last week, I was in Moses Lake talking to a company called Group 14, and they have invented a way to make an anode for a battery that can accommodate more lithium atoms and not degrade its utility. This could be a game changer in battery technology. Very exciting new development that could come out of Washington State. And you're just seeing that all through these industries. So the part of technological optimism is a thing that I had in 2007, and I still have it because those improvements are still happening today. We just need to accelerate them by use of the policies that we have.
Well, your leadership, especially on combating the climate crisis, has inspired us and millions of other people to do more work, toward a more just and sustainable future. We could not be more honored to have you on our show. Governor Jay Inslee, thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you. Keep working, get vaccinated, and root for our new team, the Seattle Kraken. We got a new ice hockey team too. We want to keep that ice from melting, so we got to defeat climate change.
That's
we'll
right.
See you guys again, I hope.